increasing number of academics are calling for the decolonization of education. You remember the term gaining traction around the Fees Must Fall protest. Many of those youngsters calling about the nature and the kind of education that they've been given in South African institutions. But how do academics envisage implementing curriculums which are in fact decolonized, and I think more in touch too with what African scholars have produced previously? Joining me in studio to discuss this is University of Johannesburg's Professor Veli Mitova. Thank you so much for your time tonight, Prof. The conversation around decolonizing education has been a big one, and your lecture in particular has been focusing on decolonizing knowledge as a whole, and I think just the approach to different knowledge systems and what we ultimately come to define as knowledge and how it got there in the first place. Those are just some of the key questions that you're asking us to interrogate.
I was asking that, yes.
Yes.
I was also pushing for a particular kind of approach to decolonizing knowledge. The idea that one shouldn't just say, there's your truth and my truth, and we're all right. So when people disagree, there's one truth. And I was saying that if you think that there's your truth and my truth, then people who think that we shouldn't decolonize knowledge are right, and that seems terribly wrong to me. So that was the kind of thing that I was pushing for.
And why is this conversation sometimes, had in such binary terms, where it's either absolute or there's some level of relativism in having that conversation?
I think that the conversation itself is not binary, but this was kind of clearing the ground for putting it on the right track in terms of being able to say, look, guys, we ought to decolonize knowledge, absolutely. And then from there on, we can talk about what that means, right? And what kind of measures need to be implemented at the institutional level and at various departments.
When we talk about knowledge, it's quite a broad term. So for the benefit of me and my viewers, when we're talking about decolonizing knowledge, what in essence are we challenging that is a particular way that we're saying, in fact, that is not the entire story of what that knowledge system might be?
I think that in a nutshell, we're challenging the idea that West is the best in all areas of knowledge. And the idea that Africa has a lot to give is the oldest place, right, and the oldest people. And ignoring these insights coming from here is a great mistake from a knowledge point of view as well as a moral mistake.
Of course, one of the things that is often raised, especially when you look at how history has been written, how knowledge in fact has been documented over the years, it has been mainly quite exclusionary to a particular group of people. What is the kind of work that you as academics then have to do to not only be able to capture the essence of that lost knowledge, but to also then say that the future can be different if we start storing it differently to what was done in the past?
Well, we can do several things. It's obviously, we're still at the beginning of this trip.
Sure.
But certainly I'm a philosopher, so what we do at my department at UJ, African philosophy. So we incorporate a lot of African thought as well as Eastern thought we're beginning to think about into our philosophy. We also think that the importance of language can't be underestimated. So the way English has colonized people's minds, right? So we are trying to think about how to teach philosophy in African languages. So we have tutors who speak various African languages to help students incorporate these ideas in their own, absorb them in their own languages. We're also starting to run a bursary for next year for students to actually do research in their own language. So we're trying to experiment with these ideas.
What is generally the response when you talk about decolonizing knowledge? Because often you talk about a mentality that has been entrenched, and South Africa happens to be one of those countries where it's not hard to look to find people who say, well, actually, there's nothing wrong with knowledge the way that it is. Why must we care about what other African scholars have said? So generally, what do you find that the response is? Do you find that people might think, well, we might be getting lesser than education, lesser than ways of theorizing and making sense of the world?
I think at UJ we're very committed to this idea, so it's a very common ground for us to be debating these ideas. But I've certainly met with resistance outside academia, where people are saying, "Look, here's business. English is the world's language. So what are you doing here?" So I've had very mixed reactions, and I think the clue is not to look at this as some kind of contracting affair, like we're contracting knowledge by decolonizing. I think that's a terrible mistake, because what we're doing is actually opening up to various other ways of looking at things, various cultures looking.
You speak in particular about the impact of colonial history and what that has meant for shaping knowledge. In a country like South Africa, where we then also have apartheid as part of our history, how much more complex does that conversation become?
About 20,000 times, I think. So I think that the decoloniality story is still very rough in terms of the labels we use. So a lot goes under that label. And certainly de-apartheiding is part of it, because that's shaped many of our students' minds, as well as coloniality. So there's an older legacy and a newer legacy. And all of these kind of ills are wrapped up in this decoloniality label.
And in terms of finding acceptance in international scholarship, is that something that you have to worry about?
I don't think so. I travel quite a bit, and I've been giving decolonial talks in a couple of places. I'm giving one in Switzerland in December. In the UK, it's the talk of town. They're actually really beginning to wake up as well to this idea that, there's not just a bunch of people and that they're the center of the world. So they're making a lot of efforts actually in the UK in that direction as well.
How much more work do you think is going to need to be done for it to have full acceptance within academia? So to be almost research on scale as other forms of academic exploration?
I think we're at the beginning of the trip, and some places are better than others.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I'm very proud of my university, because we're really beginning to make strides forward. I think there's a long way to go still, however.
What do you foresee as being some of the biggest challenges that you'll have to encounter?
Well, we need to. Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think that the biggest challenge is probably the outside world, the way grants work and so on. So when you want to get a grant, the same people are setting the parameters of what counts as proper knowledge, what counts as proper research, right? So it's tricky for us to get funding for these kinds of projects that are more involved in our context. And I guess, that's one of the biggest challenges.
Would it help if the continent was more invested in more work being done around different types of knowledge systems? Would that make your job easier?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. But in a way, it has to start with us as well, right? So you need to break through that barrier when you start. You need to be able to publish it in this work that we're doing here. Yeah. So it needs to gain traction in the world first, in some ways.
And I wonder, in terms of African scholars, I mean, we have a few that have really gained notoriety on a global scale, but certainly it's not to the level that we have seen some Western scholars. Do you think that it's as a result of the question of, again, which you're discussing so strongly around how knowledge then is perceived and received?
Absolutely,
yeah.
So I completely agree with that. That there's, and this is part of the things that we need to be doing to be growing that scholarship. But it's not just a matter of growing it; it's also a matter of allowing space for existing scholarship, because they're very good African scholars. We have very good African scholars as well. And it's part of the climate that we live in, that it's only now beginning to become obvious to us that there's such a thing as African philosophy, all of these things. And that's part of the thing that we're fighting.
You know, of course, one of the conversations here is how different approaches might be, even to just communal living, you know, to the construction, even just of how democracy is set up versus what it may have been before states in Africa were colonized. Those are two completely different ways of operating and of living. Do you foresee somewhere in the future where these systems are able to live side by side and not necessarily have one being looked at as lesser than the other? If we're to fully incorporate what this knowledge has given the past and certainly what it could give the future.
Absolutely. I mean, I dream of it daily, right? And I think that the differences are very often exaggerated, actually, between the Western world and you know, so these worldviews. And I think that's one of the mistakes that we make, that we overemphasize the differences, and then the problem becomes quite insurmountable. But I think that we already live in a space where the African thought and Eastern thought and so on are not looked down on. So certainly within my circles, they're not. But I see that there's a long way to go in terms of the public and how the public perceives these things.
And what do you think is a key drive of that public perception? Is it because of the amount of material that we consume generally that is from the West, the kind of content we're consuming that is from the West? And of course, ultimately, all of that works its way in our subconscious, doesn't it?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, this is how we've been trained. That's how we've been conditioned. That's what we see as cool. And it's, you know, it's very often a mistake, actually.
Sure. It's certainly a very interesting and fascinating subject, and we'll be watching to see how you guys at UJ University are working to get it right. It'll be interesting to also speak to some of your students who you'll be commissioning to conduct research into this. It's an important conversation, especially for a country like ours. Professor Veli Mitova, she's of course with the University of Johannesburg. We're going to take a short break. I'm back in a moment. We'll be in conversation then with the Minister of Small Business. He'll be talking to us about the regulation changes that are being made in the industry to ease access, particularly for small to medium enterprises. We'll find out how exactly they think they're making things easier. After this, we'll have a quick look at your day's headlines.